my other big tip, and this is my personal tip, but I share this with parents all the time, that before, there's a whole thing about getting ready for the IEP, right? How do you prepare for the IEP? And we all prepare in different ways. I really encourage you, if you're on skills, it gives you appropriate goals to go in with and benchmarks and, everything that you could possibly need, and it spits it out for you, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Because I'm an ex-teacher, I used to be researching curriculum and, figuring out, well, these are the goals. And I work with a great team who come in and tell me substantive goals, but that was never enough for me. I wanted to, be a part of. And skills makes that so much easier. But beyond that, what I would do to organize myself is, and I still do this to this day, is in the days before the IEP, I sit down and write out a letter to the IEP team, and that my husband and I sign, and on it I have step by step, here are our criteria of what's important, here is what we need to have on the IEP in order to sign it. And I write everything down. Now, some years that's 10 things, and some years it's 4 things. It really just depends, but I clearly say, this is, it's essential that this be the setting in which my son is learning. If there's a recommendation for a teacher that I want, or a timeline in which I want to know who the teacher is, I put that on there. If, whatever it is, whatever extenuating services that I want or don't want, and I do this for a couple of different reasons, because once I have that all down, I know what I'm going in there looking for, and I don't have to worry about anything else, because there are things that happen that sidetrack you, and somebody says something and you wanted to get into that discussion, but you have a roadmap in front of you. You know exactly, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so I listen for these things. The letter sits in front of me on the table. Everybody can see it, and I eventually read it into the tape recorder to them. But I listen for these things that I go, oh, okay, they just addressed one. Oh, okay, that's already done. We're not going to have a problem with that one. We're in a complete agreement on that. Fabulous, right? And then we move on to, and somebody else is talking, and I go, oh, well, there's the second element. Great, this is working great. There's usually 1 or 2 things on the list that aren't answered, though, in the meeting. And usually what happens is that you go to your IEP and they make their offer of FAPE, right? Which is free appropriate public education. And they will say those words, and they will say, our offer of FAPE includes, and they've decided all of this before the meeting. Because there's a level of preparation that they have to have decided what their offer is. They've done whatever assessments, and they say, so based on everything everybody just said, here is our offer of FAPE. Now, you have the ability to negotiate that and say, we disagree, that our position is that FAPE would also include X, Y, and Z. And then you're in a negotiation and having a conversation. Well, if you take the paper home and you say, I want to read it over and da-da-da-da, and then I want to come back in, and then you offer something back in, it can be this long drawn out, and it's this whole thing about balls in your court now. And I like to leave the ball in their court always. So they know that I'm not going to sign it, because they've been through this with me over and over and over again. Then I'm always going to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to take it home. Even if it had everything on my letter, I would still say I need to take it home to read it over to make sure that it's there. But usually there's at least one thing on the list that needs to be addressed. And so instead of making a letter after I go home, so that it takes another 2 weeks for them to answer it, I don't like to do that. I like to expedite, that's the word I want. So I have the letter all ready and signed by my husband and I. So they do their offer of FAPE, and I say, here is what, and I read the whole thing, regardless of whether they've already addressed some of it or not. And I make sure that the tape recorders are still whirring when I do it. And I read it in and say, here are what's important to us. And I will comment and say, clearly we're in agreement on that. And go on to the second thing, clearly we're in agreement on that. And here is, the thing. And so and when I'm all done, I'll say, so we will look forward to hearing your response to, numbers 3 and 7, whatever. And and we hand them over the letter, and I have a letter in my possession, a copy of it, obviously, but we hand it over to them, and then the meeting packs up and whatever. And usually within a short period of time, I hear back saying, okay, we cannot offer you number 7, or yep, we can. And then the discussion continues. But I want you to know that it's a negotiation, and that what happens when you're clear, because sometimes you go in and you're so nervous and somebody says something and afterwards you say, I wished I'd said, or I forgot to bring up, right? And the letter for me makes it impossible for that to happen. Anything that is important to me is on that letter, and anything that isn't important to me, not on the letter, I don't need to discuss it. So somebody brings something not up on the letter, I let it go, because there are times that things will happen and you go, that's irritating and I'd like to discuss that. And you go, it's not on the letter. It's not important. And it's so important that for me, I have to remind myself when I'm going into the IEP, it's not about being right? Because you can get into somebody a discussion because you know you're right? But that's not what your child's IEP is about. It's not about being right. It's about making sure that your child gets set up for success the following year with appropriate services. That's all it's about. And if I have my list, I know exactly what I'm going in for. I make sure that the list is reasonable, that I'm not asking for things that are inappropriate. I also make sure that I am not asking for things that are the best. I know as a parent that rankles every time. It's still hard to say all these many years later that the school is not legally required to give you what is best. They're only required to give you what's appropriate. And that's I put everything through that filter. I have an opening statement in my letter that says, my child has a diagnosis of autism, been documented in this way, and this way, and this way. And he, we know that he has sensory issues. We know that, this, that, and the other thing. And as a result, we feel that the following is appropriate for his continuing ability to access the curriculum. And I word it that way, that these things are necessary and important and appropriate in order for him to continue to access the curriculum. And so that's the way that is all worded. I don't say, I want to fight with you about this. I don't say, my child deserves what's best. It's just what's appropriate for him to be able to successfully access the curriculum. And by the way, part of the curriculum and part of what FAPE says is that the child has to be having social skills developed. There's very specific language. We need to get Bonnie Yates back in here. As I'm saying this, I'm realizing all this. And we'll put in a call to her to come back in. But there is a phrase that's specific to social things and preparing a child. Part of their education and part of their curriculum is preparing them for ongoing to be able to function in society. So when people don't want to include, for instance, an aide at lunchtime, that's what comes under that heading. And that you can argue in terms of, well, that's not appropriate because he's supposed to be accessing the curriculum, part of which is social. And that, in that playtime. So we'll get Bonnie back in here. But I want you guys to know that if you take the time, and I've shared this with hundreds of parents, probably thousands of parents by now, and said, write a letter. Write a letter, get it all clear, spend the time. That's how you want to prepare and say, this is what is so important to me for next year. Get it so that the statement is clear, so that there's no possibility that you're going to get sucked into discussions that have nothing to do with what's appropriate for your child for next year. And you're not going to leave anything out. You won't be, suddenly sitting up straight at night, 2 nights later going, oh, I can't believe we forgot to talk about this. It just won't happen. That's what I'm doing this week, is getting my letter together. And I encourage you to as well. It's been very effective at keeping me on point and reasonable and getting what is appropriate. So take it or leave it. That's my suggestion for this week for IEPs, but absolutely request in writing the tape recorder.